You're very welcome to the fourth episode of our Insight series here, hosted by BSI in partnership with McAfee. I'm Stephen Bowes. I'm the Global Practice Director here at BSI Consulting Services, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Nigel Hawthorn, who is McAfee's Cloud and Privacy Spokesperson. Hi, Nigel.
Hi, Steve.
Thanks. So, first of all, we want to make sure you to subscribe to receive notifications for any future episodes that are coming in the near future. And in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about data loss prevention, a topic Nigel and I are very passionate about. And we're going to be talking about the cloud. We're going to cover all things DLP and specifically some data trends we are seeing. And we're going to cover the data lifecycle, talk about the value of data. And we're going to talk about what is DLP and what are the different forms and considerations of data loss prevention, the cause of data loss. And we're going to talk about some client cases, a public case that's in the public domain, and also a case that we've worked on ourselves. How to prevent DLP. So a lot of stuff there, a large topic, and we've got only a small amount of time. So we're going to get started. And what I want to open up with is around data. At the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to prevent the loss of data. So why is that? And the reason for that is the data that we have. The size of data is growing exponentially. Everybody's aware of this. And indeed, IDC have estimated that there's a year-on-year growth of 30% of data internally in enterprises. Every 60 seconds, there are about 187 million emails sent and over 150 terabytes of content created. That's every 60 seconds. And if we look at the IDC's Global Datasphere 2020 report, the amount of data created over the next 3 years will be more than the data created over the past 30. Not surprising to a number of our listeners, I'm sure. What's also very interesting is that the consumer data, the size and capacity of consumer data will decrease compared to enterprise data over the next 5 years. So we'll see a seesaw effect. Obviously, the amount of consumer data is greater at the moment. You think about Netflix and consumer content that's being consumed. But that is going to actually swing back towards enterprise data over the next 5 years. And another interesting one is the fact that the ratio of unique data, so that data is newly created data and captured data, the ratio of that data to replicated data, that data has been copied, is currently 9-1. So for every individual piece of data, on average, it's been replicated in 9 different locations. There's 9 versions of it. And that doesn't surprise if you think about, let's say, for example, I create an email and I create an attachment and I send the attachment to my team, and there's a team of 5 people. So it's in my sent items. It's on my local device where I've saved it. It's in their inboxes. And then somebody then forwards it onto somebody else, and you can suddenly see how the 9-1 ratio becomes quite obvious. And indeed, IDC are estimating it'll grow to a 10-1 ratio by 2024. So the amount of duplication out there is quite profound. Microsoft, who are just flying this year in 2021, for 2020, have issued their Q1 results in October, just gone, and they've outlined that they have 115 million daily active users of Office 365. And that's up 53% since April 2020. It's incredible consumption of their services and data passing through their ecosystem. So what's important here, and one of the lessons I've taken out of all these numbers are phenomenal, is we're going to have to let technology do the work. The numbers are too big from a manual perspective. We need to bring technology into play, and we're going to talk about that shortly. Data lifecycle. One thing we need to understand when we're considering a data loss prevention program, or even talk about data loss, is actually the journey that data goes on. To remind people of the data lifecycle, data is created first of all. So we're creating data, we're creating Excel spreadsheets, we're creating databases, mails, and so on and so forth. But then what happens is we store them. So they're being stored somewhere. And we want to talk about controls around that. The value of the data really increases exponentially when we're using it and sharing it. So these next 2 elements of the data journey that's on. It's been used, it's been consumed, it's been edited, amended, shared. And that's where the data value is really very, very high. And again, this pertains to data loss prevention. You don't mind losing data that has no value, but you do mind losing data that has a high amount of value. And when data is being stored, shared, and used, that's when it's got its highest amount of value. Ultimately, data becomes aged, where it becomes of less value. But it doesn't have no value, because what you're saying about this data set, you're saying, okay, we have this data here, we've no active use for it, but we don't want to get rid of it just yet. We might need it for whatever reasons. So we'll archive it, and we'll leave a pointer record in the original system. So archiving is where it has the value is dropping. And then finally, data gets to a point where it has no value, has 0 value to you, it's of no use to you, or indeed it could be of negative value. It could actually cost you more than it's worth in which case data should be destroyed. And this is the journey that data goes on, from being created, stored, used, shared, archived, and destroyed. And Nigel, I think you've probably seen something like this over the years.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about the value of data changing over time. And I think we can probably all remember stories of people who had to issue their financial results early because, unfortunately, they started to leak. And let's use that as a great example. If you work for a company and you see the financial information, you probably have it for a couple of weeks before it's made public. During that time, it's possibly the most valuable data that is inside the organization. But the second that it has been made public, it's of no additional value if it were to get distributed. And so you could even define this piece of data as being valuable up until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., but of no value at that point. And I do think we need to look at data over time. I've been living in this house for quite a long time. I still receive physical mail at my house addressed to the previous occupant. You know, somebody has gathered that data, they've kept that data, and they're spending money generating mail shots that are actually useless because the person doesn't live here anymore. So let's make sure that we look at it at the end of its life as well, and make sure that we're not keeping data that actually has got to the end of its value.
Absolutely. And, you know, without dwelling on it, but it's certainly topic at the moment with the COVID research that's going on, with the pharmaceutical firms all in the race to develop their vaccines and their therapeutics. You know, the value of that intellectual property is phenomenal, and the controls that they need to be putting in place have to mirror that as well. So, yeah, absolutely. The value of data needs to be taken into account when we're defining our DLP policy and our program. So just to come into to talk about exactly what is data loss prevention, what is DLP, and you know, if you Google this, you get various definitions and interpretations based on which website you land on, which vendor you're talking about, which international framework or association you're talking to. But ultimately, the definition of a DLP is it has a couple of broad areas, and really it's about detecting potential data breaches and transmissions of exfiltration attempts and preventing them by monitoring. So making people aware that these are being done, so detecting them and blocking the data whilst it's trying to be exfiltrated, while the breach is trying to occur. And also blocking it whilst in use, in motion, or indeed at rest. So one of the key things for me, I'm 25 years in the game now this year, and is what's driving DLP adaptation. Now, DLP is a long-standing concept. And, years ago, I worked in financial services. I was on the infrastructure teams, I was on project teams, and sometimes we'd see the information security officer coming down the corridor, we'd walk in the opposite direction because security was seen as this speed bump on the way to getting things done. But what we're seeing from our side is driving at this DLP adaptation is the new breed of roles that are coming in, CISOs and chief data officers, who are bringing in this new regime. It's been recognized of the value of data and the damage that can be done by a breach. So it's being brought in that way. Obviously, we're still seeing the regulatory and compliance side of things as well. And that's been expanded obviously with GDPR in 2018, CCPA last year. There's a wider set of regulatory and compliance requirements beyond the existing ones like BSI and HIPAA and others. So that they're really driving it. Nigel, from your side, what do you agree? Do you see other factors driving adaptation of DLP?
Yeah, I think that obviously regulations are helping remind us to do the right things. Let's be honest, they are there because they're necessary. But I'm now seeing more people who are taking a bigger picture view and are realizing the costs of data loss to their brand, to their customers, to their potential revenue. And I think that's a great thing, actually, because it shows that we are taking this very much more seriously than we used to.
Yeah, agreed, 100%. So let's dive into the what are some of the causes of data loss? What are some of the ways? And we're not going to be exhaustive here. We want to be indicative, really just point out some of the key areas that we've seen, and that will help drive the mitigation program. So what I would always say to people who, are thinking about data loss prevention program and trying to identify the causes, look to your industry sources. There's some really good industry sources out there, and indeed, listen to this podcast is you're doing exactly what we're saying. So one of the key ones that we look to as well internally is the Verizon report, and I call out two of them: the Data Breach Investigations Report, the BIR, which is issued annually, and the Insider Threat Report. And I wanted to zone in a couple of areas of those as causes of data loss. So one of the big causes is obviously malware. And in 20%, 27%, according to the DBIR Verizon report, in 27% of malware is ransomware. Okay, so we know what's going on there. And one of the key things we've seen with ransomware is that it's not just traditional ransomware. So ransomware, of course, gets in through a vector. Of course, what is the key vectors there? The top vectors, according to the Verizon, is email links, email attachments, and malware downloads. So navigating to websites, clicking on websites that have loaded pages. So traditionally, ransomware, of course, got in, encrypted the system at a certain point in time, and then obviously you got your interaction with the bad actors to say, look, can you pay us X amount of money, and we'll give you the encryption keys. And of course, best practice and industry guidance is do not pay for the keys. Put other steps in place. But we are seeing a lot of organizations don't have the appropriate tools in place and data protection in place, which we'll speak about shortly. So ransomware is a big one, but what we have discovered in the last couple of years, last 2 years specifically, is ransomware has evolved, and now what we're seeing is what's happening is that the bad actors are getting in, they're navigating through the systems, they have the ability to encrypt, but what they're also doing is they're exfiltrating the data out. It might not be all the data, but certainly elements of the data, if not all of it, exfiltrating that out over a period of time. So it's basically taking a copy of it offline, and then they can ransomware the source data in your organization and then send you the threat, send you the notification. But they let you know we've exfiltrated your data. So what was happening is, it's quite easy. If you have a very strong data protection program in place, data management program in place, you could simply wipe your disk space, restore your data from the last known good, last night's backup, remove the threat from the network, do your scans, remove the threat, reset privileges and passwords, take the appropriate actions in a series of actions, and get back online reasonably quickly. So the bad actors have recognized that, and that's what's been done. And they also recognize the industry is following legal, law enforcement's advice to not pay. So what they're doing is they're exfiltrating the data, and what they're then saying is that they've got a two-tier approach. They can encrypt your data and destroy it, but they can also release it, or they can sell it on. So that's an evolution of ransomware. And we've even seen cases where they don't even encrypt the data. They simply say, we've got in, we've all taken a copy of your data, now pay us, or we will encrypt it. So there's variations of ransomware, which is interesting, and we're going to speak about how to prevent that shortly. And then another area we want to jump in on. Sorry, Nigel, go ahead.
Well, can I just jump in? A couple of things that I think are worth talking about in 2020. One is, of course, with so many of us working from home, and often people working from home using BYOD or other devices, we are seeing that people are trying various different ways to get in via the employees and not necessarily going and attacking straight into headquarters. And then secondly, I don't know if you saw this, just a couple of weeks ago, there was some medical data released, and the ransomware people didn't go to the organization that lost it, but started going to the individuals and asked each of them for a very small amount of money not to release their particular data. And wow, that's interesting and scary. And you just sort of think they're looking for any way that they can monetize this content, not always attacking through the front door where you might expect, but coming in every single direction and trying to extract money in any way they can.
No, you're absolutely correct, and this is exactly what we're saying: the evolution of ransomware away from the traditional model of getting in and encrypting. And focusing on another element of these reports, the insider threat report, is exactly that: the insider threat. It's been disclosed now through the reporting that 30% of all breaches are due to insider threats, and they come in a couple of different variations. You've got the careless worker. You've got the person who makes a mistake, basically. And discloses data that way. You've got the inside agent, which is basically someone who infiltrates an organization with the purposes of stealing data on behalf of another party. So they're an inside agent. You can have the disgruntled employee, which I think is fairly self-explanatory, and you can have the malicious insider. So this is another insider, like the inside agent, but the malicious insider is someone who steals for themselves as against stealing on behalf of a third party. And then another insider threat that needs to be taken into account, and this is a big one, is the third party the third party. So these are the ones who are in your supply chain, who make a mistake, who are negligent, who don't have the controls. Perhaps you do, and we've seen big attacks there. We saw Target in terms of their POS, their point of sale attacks many years ago was through the third party. So these are a number of insider threats that need to be taken care of, to be allowed for in your data loss prevention program, and should be considered. Nigel, anything to add there before we move on?
Yeah, I always feel uncomfortable with the phrase careless worker. Unfortunate worker. I just think that we miss at our peril the complexity that workers have to deal with today. The number of different bits of data that we share with them, the number of different systems that they have to learn how to use, and the fact that they need education and training on, what does bad look like? Does that look like an email that's appropriate and real, or is it actually malicious? I mean, we do phishing tests where we send messages to our own employees, myself included, and there was one last week that said, please click on this link to confirm the time and date you want to have the meeting about, and I can't really remember what the topic was, but I thought, wow, that was really well written. It looked plausible. But I clicked on the link saying this looks like phishing, and sure enough, it came back and said, yes, it was part of our test. So I do think we need to be constantly vigilant, even ourselves. We need to test ourselves to make sure that we're not going to be this, as you say, maybe careless or unlucky worker.
Yeah, absolutely, and that will form part of our data loss prevention recommendations. In the next section. One thing I do want to speak about actually is two case studies. One for a client of ours that we worked on, I worked on personally, and then one a public case study, just to talk about something that's in the public domain. So when I was trying to choose an appropriate data loss DLP case study, there's so many to choose from, So I simply said, look, I'll just do the most recent one, which happened to be with Sweden's largest private insurer, Folksam Group. They have a $50 billion in insurance assets, and they have disclosed that they have inadvertently shared up to 1 million people's client data with Facebook, Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Adobe. And that was according to a statement issued on Tuesday, the 3rd of November. The firm said it discovered the breach after an internal audit, and said it had reported the breach to Sweden's data inspectorate. So again, that actually sounds to me like exactly what you said, Nigel. Careless worker or careless team. It sounds to me like a misconfiguration. I don't have any details beyond the public statements, but it sounds to me like that a database or a container or some kind of data repository was shared inadvertently, links to shared links or whatever it was, and not just to anybody, but to Facebook. And it says it very blandly that we've shared it with Facebook, Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Adobe. To what extent, who in Facebook, Microsoft had access to it? Very, very. I'd be very curious about. Any comments on that case study, Nigel?
Well, I think we probably all know that health data is the most valuable that there is for an individual. You can't change your health data, and the difficulty we could have is, in years to come, you could get a different price point on insurance than I do because an organization has got your health data and my health data. And that, just think of it from your own point of view rather than a business point of view. That is truly scary.
No, it really is, and just reinforcing that point on the case study. So a client that we worked with many years ago had an accidental disclosure data as well. Actually, this was a financial company dealing with loans and mortgages and lending products, and they had compiled an Excel spreadsheet for whatever purpose internally, and they inadvertently sent it to a supplier. So that supplier must have been on a CC or whatever it was, a blind copy. And they received, and that client was outside of the jurisdiction. It was in a different geographical location, which made it a bit tricky. To be fair, the company realized the mistake quite quickly. They contacted the DPO, the Data Protection Office, and we were engaged as a result of that. So what we did there was, and this is very important for our clients, is to apply a project management approach. It's to bring a structure around the incident response. Asking 3 questions: who, what, and when. Okay, so what are we going to do? What are the steps we need to take to mitigate it? We need to contact the person that has received it. Who's going to do that? Who's the person to do that? And when are we going to do it? And build out a schedule of tasks to ensure that all tasks are done. You need to ensure that we have to provide evidence of destruction or deletion of the data from the third party. So we had to engage them through screen sharing, and we had to apply data destruction processes there on their infrastructure with their goodwill, and it was a goodwill situation. We weren't physically at their offices, many thousands of miles away. And then we had to generate a report outlining everything that was done, the scope of the incident, the steps that were taken, and to provide evidence of the deletion and destruction of the appropriate data. And that was acceptable to the DPO, who then closed the case with minimal punishment for the client, because they've done the right things in the right way in a timely fashion. So very similar to the Swedish one, but just obviously from a financial perspective. So these are typical case studies that we're seeing, and we're seeing it, as Nigel, you'll see, on a daily basis. So what's very important to our listeners is talk about some of the steps that can be done to prevent data loss. How do we prevent data loss occurring? And one way to look at it is simply to reverse engineer the causes we've outlined. We spoke about malware, we spoke about insider threats, and so on. So Nigel, from your side, what are some of the key steps that our clients, customers who are listening on this podcast can take to prevent data loss?
Well, number one, of course, not all data is created equally. And, you need to work out what's valuable to you. And is it your customer list? Is it you mentioned, COVID research? Is it therefore research and development for the next product along? Is it your financial results? And you've got to sit down with all of the data owners to try to work out really where your crown jewels will live. And then work out how you find out where it is, which systems it lives in, and not forgetting, of course, as you said, if everything is being copied so many times, where else does it live? I think I've seen, unfortunately, quite a lot of people who feel that they have locked down their main repository, and then they forget that they've got employees wandering around with spreadsheets and databases on their own individual laptops. So we do need to follow the data. We need to watch where it's going. Data in motion, data at rest, and make sure with the growth of working from home, the growth of cloud, that we are looking at systems that aren't actually owned by us. All of these systems may be used either by the corporation or by individual teams and users, and we need to check what's going on and where data is living, because you can only control it if you know where it is. Yeah, Step absolutely. 2, I guess, then, is who has access to it. And, the idea of looking at the roles, looking at least privilege. I, as an example, only deal with customers and information in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. There is no reason why I should have access to information on customers and financial results in Asia or the Americas. And happily, the way that the system is set up, I don't have access to that. In fact, I feel very privileged and pleased that I don't have access to that. That's one more thing I don't need to worry about. So I think the staff need to be involved, and you need to work out who needs what and give them, honestly, access to as little information as possible. If we think of some of the stories where lots of data has got lost, I've been sitting there reading the articles saying, well, who on earth had access to all of that data all at once? The basics of restricting what people have access to need to be the starting point of keeping things secure. Then I think we've got, and I mentioned it before, but training employees, it will never be enough, but it needs to be really a key part of everything. You need to not just say you need to watch a video for an hour every year, but keep on testing them, keep on trying things, keep on checking, and even, let's share some internal examples. If something goes wrong, I think many organizations hide that even from their internal employees. But every time something does go wrong, there are lessons to be learned. And I think we should be a little more open with our own teams about what might happen, what happened in the past. Okay, let's not name names, but we noticed in this department, for instance, and let's use a cloud-based example, that employee X decided to sign up to a third-party cloud-based backup service that backed up everything on their laptop. Why? Well, because they had both their personal data as well as business data on there, and they hadn't asked for approval. And then, unfortunately, that data got lost from that backup service. That is a lesson to be learned for all of us, that we should be very careful about what individual services that we use, because data may well be flowing out of our individual devices without us thinking about it.
Actually, just coming on that, so that's one of the key mitigation steps that can be taken as part of the DLP prevention program is your data management, data protection, exactly what you said. And we would always say to our clients, you should have a tiered model here around primary, secondary, and tertiary backups to ensure that you have the ability to recover and restore that data. And it should be on different medium as well. You should be bringing a range of stuff. So we would advocate cloud-based backup for cloud-based systems. But the key thing there is around data encryption. If the data is encrypted, what's your key management? Where are your keys stored? Who accesses? So take the example you just given there, Nigel, of a third party doing a backup to the cloud. No problem with that at all. Makes perfect sense. You're taking it off of whatever the primary location is, but that data should be encrypted, and the key management should be with the data owners. It should be with the organization as well. So I think that's very important, because one of the key mitigations, not just for ransomware, which will be one of the big ones, because that means your data is unavailable and you want to be able to restore it, but also for malicious insiders. A malicious insider could very well go in and destroy data, and not just holistically end to end, but also specifically. You've called out, there might be quite specific malicious, and then they might recognize the value of some data and destroy those elements of it. And also, there's also systems failure. I remember working on a system one time where it was a database system, and the client was getting sporadic results back from queries. They were running queries, expecting a certain set of results, getting a different set of results. And what happened actually was that the disk subsystem had degraded the actual physical spinning disks that they were working on at the time, and that had caused what we call torn pages in a SQL database. And that basically meant that the values in the fields, the rows and columns of the database, they were being corrupted. So when you ran a query, it wasn't calling back the data from those fields because it wasn't call backable. So luckily they had a very mature data management system in place, very strong replication synchronization system in place, and they were able to retrieve the data from an alternative system going back a period of time. So data management, data protection is a very important part of your data loss prevention program. Nigel, I think one of the other elements that we talk about ransomware is visibility into data traffic. I think that'd be fair to say, especially on the egress side of things. What's your take on that, and what's your experience on that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, again, you look at the reports and you see that when a company announces that they've had a data loss incident, the attackers may have been in the system for months, and they've been walking around looking for data, and then they've grabbed it, and it's some time before it's noticed. So, you really need to have a robust system that is looking for attackers, looking for people who've come in. There's the MITRE ATT&CK framework is really useful for the SOC team to look at, and that's now been enhanced for all sorts of other attacks. So there are systems that will watch cloud-based attacks using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So that's really useful, because you need to be able to start looking at unusual traffic behavior, unusual patterns that may well indicate some threat or other. A simplistic example would be, if I look at myself, I've worked for McAfee now for 6 or 7 years, and in that time I've used a few laptops and a few phones, and I've traveled around, and the company has the data logged of everything that I have done. And if all of a sudden I was to turn up in a brand new country with a new device, then that's 2 bits of strange behavior, and that's something that we should be watching out for. If Nigel turns up in Beijing and uses an Android device, wow, let's turn him off, because who knows what's going on? Have I lost my credentials and someone else is logging in? Because somehow it doesn't look very likely that all of a sudden I will have appeared with a brand new device in a brand new country. So this is possible. The sad thing is that often people don't think about it, and they look at the more specific thing of, has someone attacked this particular database, rather than, is this behavior odd, strange, unusual, strange patterns in the middle of the night, enormous amounts of downloads from a system that that user in the past has only done occasional reporting. All of those sorts of things can be investigated, in fact, can be proactively looked at by systems such as cloud access security brokers and DLP systems that will look for and take action on unusual behavior.
Absolutely. And if you combine that to assist you, especially from an insider threat perspective, with a really strong HR vetting process around starters and indeed the corresponding levers as well, to mitigate the disgruntled employee side of things. From a third-party perspective, we would absolutely advocate the use of third-party security questionnaires. You should create your own, but there are a number of available to you publicly if you want to use ISO 27001 as a base for building the questionnaire. You could also use the Cloud Security Alliance's CAIQ, which is their cloud initiative questionnaire, and it basically poses about 100-odd questions across a number of domains that you can use to vet your supply chain. In addition, you could be using third-party providers such as Dun & Bradstreet to get integrity ratings and other vendors as well. So very important to have that. The key thing I would say is build it into roles and responsibilities. Okay, because everything we spoke about there are technical controls and questionnaires and technology and stuff like that. But I think behaviors drive mindset, and mindset drives behaviors. So by building it into the roles, making people accountable, have a data governance program, have data owners defined, have it built into their role, their responsibility. It's their responsibility. They're accountable for it, and then drive those set of behaviors. I think would go a long way, apart from the obvious series of controls and policies and technology that you can put into place. So with that, I would like to summarize, Nigel, if I may, with our summary of what we spoke about. We spoke about really understanding the data in your organization, around the classification, around data governance, the value of data, the journey that the data takes in your organization. We talk about having an integrated approach. Whatever you put into play has to integrate what you have. You might have an ISMS or a QMS, so an information security management system, or a quality management system. You might have a PMO, project management office, or you might have SDLC if you're developing software. You need to bake this into all these elements, and it needs to all come together. You need to have it built into your business continuity planning and so on. And you need to define some of the remediation approaches that can be taken and leverage technology. As I said, the data is so vast, it can't be done manually. It has to be leveraging technology. And so the approaches, Nigel, I suppose, in terms of the remediation approaches, there's a whole series of them, isn't there? You can allow stuff, you can block, quarantine. There's a various series of triggers and actions that can be taken to remediate some potential data loss.
You can, and I think that this is where, as you say, the amount of data that's being transmitted around is vast, but also you've got users who are expecting that nothing is going to get in their way. So you need to make sure that the policies are robust, but also that they are fast to respond, and the user is told what's going on, and maybe even user remediation. If something looks like a low risk incident, maybe you allow the user to click on a link that says, yes, I've checked, I really do want to send this. Or, maybe an employee sends out a document that has a number of email addresses on it. And maybe you've set a policy that says 3 emails is okay, 5 emails in a document is unusual, but maybe low risk, but I don't know, over 20 is high risk, and we definitely want to block that. So in that sort of middle area, maybe a message comes back to the individual and says, we noticed that there were 5 email addresses in this PDF. that you sent out by email. Please click on this link to confirm that you meant to do this. And then the users can be part of remediation rather than creating a set of policies that fall apart because there's some poor person that has to try to make this sort of decision and won't be fast enough for the user's needs.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Absolutely. And the final word, if I may have it, is around understanding that this is a moving target. Data is changing on a minute-by-minute basis. The apps we're using, your cloud service providers, their infrastructure is changing. The way they, the way they apply their software as a service, or even the platform infrastructure service. And of course, your users are changing. The levers, starters, and so on and so forth. So this is not a point-in-time exercise. This has to be baked into real-time work and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is, Nigel, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining me today. And we look forward to welcoming you back on further episodes. And to all of our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of our series on privacy compliance in the cloud. Many thanks for joining us. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about GDPR and SRAMs too. So make sure you subscribe for that and receive notifications of our series. Many thanks. Talk to you all soon.